Do you expect the Thunder to pull a similar trick of being so dominant in the regular season, maybe a little bit doubted because they're early in their journey? Do you expect them to produce that in the postseason? I just had somebody call one of their games, an announcer who just texted me and said, doubt them at your peril. I mean, they're incredible. I don't know how to feel about it. I'm just a casual fan nowadays. I rely on you, Jason. Do you believe in the Thunder?
They're a legitimate top tier championship contender, but they, to me, are an example of a team that is probably not as good as their regular season record would lead you to believe. And a simple way to synthesize it would be to say Shea is the only one of their core rotation players, their core 8, like the 8 guys they'll go down with in a playoff series. Shea's the only one who's over the age of 26.
Yeah.
If you look at Boston as a counter example, and their core 8 rotation players, Tatum's the only guy who is 26. Every single other one of the guys in that rotation is older. So, like, do you really expect Boston, a defending champ, to leverage themselves night to night in a way that the group of 22-year-olds is? Like, obviously not. Like that doesn't take a ton of critical thinking. And so the reality is somewhere in the middle. And here's the thing, they can win, and they might just catch some favorable matchups, and maybe J-Dub and Chet have great playoff runs, and maybe they win. But what NBA history tells us is the Thunder will probably break through in a different circumstance. What it'll probably look like is either next year or the year after, they'll be like a 2 or a 3 seed, and people will be a little bit cool on them, but J-Dub will be 25, Chet will be a little older. They'll have been in some wars in the playoffs already. They'll have knocked on the door a few times, and suddenly they'll break through. That's what NBA history tells us. So I don't want to write off the Thunder. I think it's more likely than not that someone else wins this year.
And even if they do go to the finals, I don't like first-time finals teams. If they're going against the Celtics, I would just pound the Celtics. I haven't looked up the history of this. I think it's a little confounded by the pandemic seasons, perhaps, but this is something you get more of an appreciation for on the media side, having to fly to these games and these practices. But the finals is totally different than the rest of the postseason, and the scheduling is different, and how you do your practice is different. Media availability is different, and these teams, they're creatures of routines in many ways. It just all gets jumbled. And so if you've been through it like the Celtics have, I think that it's an advantage that wouldn't seem obvious outwardly, but it's a tremendous advantage. But now I'm getting a little bit derailed. I'm getting a little bit sidetracked, playing the Thunder forward into the finals. There's just more to go with. I like that perspective, though, on how many veterans you need. I think I call that the Kevin Arnovitz grown men win basketball games in series, or grown ass men do rule. I think I had a question about this.
I have a quick follow up on that. We've had just a crazy sequence over the course of March. I was thinking about it yesterday, because yesterday was just the 3rd time I've touched a basketball all month. And we had a death in the family. We had some travel. We had just had all this stuff going on. So it's just been like really busy. And I went to go play, and like I'm not in as good a shape because I haven't been playing, and I've been just a little distant from the game. But like, I'm at an age now where I've played so much that there's a certain amount of like just experience that I can lean on to be an effective basketball player. And I was thinking about it while I was at the gym yesterday. I was like, I remember when I was young and I was in my 20s, and we would stack up a team with a bunch of like talented young players, and we'd play in these men's leagues. And it was always like this old group of beer gut dudes who were like 38 to 45 who would like beat us every time. And like I have such another understanding for that now, because it's 2 things. It's size and strength. Like carrying that extra weight really helps. And I'm just about 25 pounds heavier than I was when I was in my early 20s. But the second piece of it is like, you can play slow, and you can understand the game, and the playoffs do slow down. And like that experience is just such a huge part of it. And like every single player I can think of has struggled in their first finals appearance. Tatum, brutal in his first finals. Like Steph, up until the end of that final series, was pretty brutal. LeBron's first finals, brutal. Even his second finals was brutal. Like, I don't know what it is, and you can pick it up immediately when you turn on the television, but it tangibly feels weird and different when you're watching a finals, even compared to the conference finals. It's such a bizarre shift. Yeah,
and I don't know how much of that is the cognizance that the country in many ways is watching, that there are maybe 20 million people watching, at least in the heyday, and this is the final round. I don't know how much of that creeps into it versus the bubble championship where Anthony Davis was just shooting easy breezy from the outside. Maybe he would have done that in a more traditional finals. I don't know. And how much of it is the scheduling being totally screwed up? I'm not sure. There's something though about the pertaining to the Thunder and Gilgeous-Alexander that you said. Well, first of all, you said that you don't like MVP debates, so you don't spend too much time on it. And I found that to be interesting. But you also said something that I thought was a good explanation, which is I think Jokic is a better basketball player than SGA, but that's never been the way we've given MVP. So your take is that SGA is the MVP and it's not even close, but that's not saying he's the best player. That's Jokic. Let's get into that. I like this topic.
It just kind of fits like the way that the award has traditionally been given out. It's always been like a combination of a bunch of factors. Now, the reason why I hate MVP, there's two main reasons. One, there is an inconsistency in the way the criteria is applied, that can get frustrating sometimes. The second piece of it, we were lamenting the overuse of advanced metrics. I've done enough picking of people's brains behind the scenes to know that a good chunk of the voter pool leans heavily on that stuff, which I just disagree with. But like, so that's part of it. Also, like, it's like, to me, it's like fantasy basketball. And you talked about the blood and bones element. I'm just really focused on real basketball in the sense that, like, I think it's more interesting to talk about like how good these teams are, how they match up against each other in the playoffs over the course of March and April than it is to talk about first team All NBA, second team All NBA. And that's kind of just a personal preference of mine. So like, I just think there are better people to talk to when it comes to that sort of thing. That said, my take on it is like over the course of the history of the league, it's been a combination of like how good your team is, how specifically valuable you are to that team. There's always been a narrative element. There's always been a momentum type of narrative element to it. And so really the foundational piece of Shea's case is that they're 11 games up on OKC or on Denver. So if you're 11 games up, your case has to be profoundly strong over that other player in order to close that gap. And like, I think there are a couple things like Shea's offensive workload has been underrated this year with Chet being out for as often as he's been out. J-Dub had a poor start to the season as a jump shooter, which was a big hit for them. Hartenstein was out a good chunk of the year. The Thunder, when they're healthy, are a super talented roster, and they're exceptionally good on defense. But Shea has carried an enormous offensive load for that team. And I think it's not Jason Tatum alongside four $30 million players. It's a lot of young dudes in their early 20s that are pretty inconsistent. And a lot of these games end up kind of degrading down into Shea's got to create everything. And he's done a really good job of it. And then the second piece of it that I think was overlooked, and I look at this like LeBron. Like LeBron got a lot of criticism for the defensive end over the course of the last, half decade for good reason. And it has hurt his team at times as he's been lazy. But we always knew LeBron could leverage himself more defensively when things mattered. I mean, he's been one of the best defensive players in the league over the last 2 months. Jokic is not that level of defender when he's healthy. But when Jokic is engaged and going on defense, he's average. He's an elite defensive rebounder, and there's one specific coverage that he can do a pretty good job of. Like Jokic has that level, but for 2 years now, he's been pulling the LeBron on defense and just saving his legs. And Denver's 20th in defense this year. It's been a consistent problem. It's been a consistent part of why they've lost games. And so I think Jokic's case just has a few too many cracks in it, and Shea's case is so strong that it's just too much to cover that 11 game gap. Like, I think it's just too much to overcome. And so, and then this is the last piece of it that I'll say. They had this head to head these last 2 games, right? And Shea dominates the first game. He drops 40. The Thunder win by 24. The Nuggets get it back last night, and Jokic goes for 35, 18, and 8. So conventional wisdom would be like, well, Jokic kind of made up for what happened the previous night. But if you watch the game, like the Thunder scored 73 points in the first half. J-Dub leaves the game with a hip strain. And Michael Malone comes out in the second half and double teams Shea the second he crosses half court the rest of the game. Because he knows J-Dub's not out there. They don't have enough offensive talent. This is going to work. And so in a weird way, even though Denver kind of flipped the script last night, it ended up being another feather in the cap of Shea's MVP case, because the way they finally slowed down the Thunder was they just straight up didn't allow Shea to cross half court with the ball. And so I think he's got a pretty commanding lead at this point.
I would agree on all counts. And I would agree Jokic being the better player and Shea given more value. And I also wish the MVP discussion would return to what it used to be, which is if you are part of the team that has submitted maybe a top 1 or 2 performance for that regular season, we go with best player on that team. Some people find that to be ridiculous. I just don't like the baseballification of the award that's happened. I thought it was maybe an original sin when Russell Westbrook won it with the being 6th in the West or whatever it was that season. That's just not what that award was. It was an award for it was a team award and a player award, even if it was never explained, because as you said, the criteria has never actually been explained, just so we can argue about everything. But this was an analytics movement to separate a player out from their performance, because people understood that baseballification, a pitcher, for instance, doesn't really control whether or not the team wins the baseball game. He just controls what he does out there. So giving Cy Young based on how many games won is absurd. That mentality was taken to the NBA with MVP, and I just don't think that's what it is. And also, I don't care as much. If you've raised your team from a level of being a 30-win team to a 45-win team, well, that's impressive. That's really cool, I guess. But realistically, in terms of the history of how we're going to remember that season, that actually doesn't do a whole lot. I'm more interested in somebody who played a starring role on a starring team than somebody who maybe created more wins in what feels like a vacuum. I can't get everybody to just agree with me on that, but I don't think that's been great. I prefer the days where we went best player on one of the 2 best teams and we knew what we were talking about.
Playing on one of the best teams in the league is a fundamentally different experience than playing on a middle tier team too. I thought it was super interesting when JJ talked about this in an interview. It was in the last couple of weeks, but he talked about how one of the most surprising things for him about becoming an NBA coach was how important it is just to get your guys to play hard. And it makes a lot of sense when you really think about it, because playing winning championship basketball sucks. It's a lot of running, a lot of mental fatigue as you're relentlessly executing a game plan night to night. There's a certain level of physical competing in terms of for defensive positioning and defensive rebounding and offensive rebounding and all these different things. It sucks. And so actually doing it every night is a challenge, especially when you're trying to coach a bunch of millionaires. I thought that quote from JJ Redick was really fascinating. I've referred to this concept over the years as motivational advantage. And the motivational advantage even extends into the playoffs. I think there are a lot of betting opportunities when a team is up 2-0 and they go on the road. That game 3 at home is always such a buzzsaw to try to win on the road. The motivational advantage is a huge part of series basketball and regular season basketball. And so playing for a low pressure 47-win Oklahoma City Thunder team, you're just getting a lot more mediocre efforts every night out of opponents. Whereas it's okay, James Harden and the Rockets are coming to town. They're the number 2 seed in the West or the 1 seed in the West or whatever. It's a totally different challenge. Every time Shea shows up in an arena now, that team is looking for an opportunity for a signature win, the team they're playing against. And so I think in general, extending to your point that being one of the top teams is just a fundamentally different experience. And so that's a big part of why that player is dealing with a tougher challenge every single night.